to the Xan Shoob podcast, where we discuss all things college football. My name is Xan. This is my co-host Shoob. We got another good video for you and show for you today, as usual. For those of you watching on YouTube, we'll be posting this up with graphics so you can follow along. For those of you who are tuning into the podcast, we appreciate you coming right back for some more football. Today we'll be discussing the Big Ten over and under betting odds and just how we feel about the whole situation moving forward per Caesars. Shoob, would you like to explain how we're going to do this whole system?
Sure. So like you just said, these lines are based off of Caesars Sportsbook as of today's recording date, June 21st. And we're simply going to go through how we feel over or under for each team's win total in the Big Ten. We're going to start with the West Division. Xan will be in the X column. If you're looking on YouTube, I will be in the S column. And we're going to alternate back and forth between every team. This video, we're going to do the Big Ten West, and then in another video we will release later, we'll go through the Big Ten East. If you're listening on podcast, we're going to go through the whole Big Ten. So follow along. It's going to be a good ride. Hopefully we'll provide some good analysis here. So without further ado, the Big Ten West starting up top, Wisconsin sitting at a whole number at 9.0 wins. Xan, what do you got?
So it's always hard with the Big Ten. When we were going through here and evaluating these teams, it was just so hard for me to pick. But one thing that really stands out to me about Wisconsin is they are just such a good ball running team. They have such an elite offensive line. They have an amazing pass rusher. They have an amazing running back in Braylon Allen, who, by the way, was recruited as a linebacker. That's an interesting fact about him. He, as a true freshman last year, ran for 1,268 yards and 12 touchdowns, averaging 7 yards per carry. What a beast. In addition to that, this is just how good Wisconsin is at running the football. They had another rusher whose name is Ches Malusi, who had 815 yards and 7 touchdowns. So they had 2,000 yards rushing just between two guys. That just shows, and it just speaks volumes about Wisconsin when you think about the success they've had at the running back position. Melvin Gordon, Monty Ball. I mean, they're constantly putting guys in the NFL. They are definitely one that knows how to develop their talent. But aside from that, I actually have Wisconsin on the over. And I know that there are some concerns here when we think about Graham Mertz. The ceiling, their floor and ceiling will be entirely determined by Graham Mertz. So he had like a little bit of a good showing when he first started playing, but then he fell off when everyone thought he was going to take that next leap. And so when we look at Graham Mertz, he is basically the limit for that offense. He plays in that pro style offense over there in Wisconsin with that offensive line. It's perfect for the run game. But when you are a quarterback in the modern era of college football, it is so difficult for you to thrive in a pro-style system. And I think that's why we see a lot of Big Ten teams with low point per game averages or considered better defensive as far as stats are concerned. So that's something that we kind of like notice with the Big Ten, because you'll see a few teams in the Big Ten, especially the higher up ones, run that kind of pro style offense. And I think to Graham Mertz, that has been a limitation for him. Last season, he had 1,900 yards, 10 touchdowns, 11 picks. That's not going to get the job done. But their defense is just so fantastic, Shoob. They had the number one defense in all the Big Ten last year. They were just so elite. They had the number one defense in all the NCAA for I believe they finished there, but they were there basically all season. That's an elite defense that we're looking at. And then not to mention, they got Nick Herbig coming back, who was fourth in sacks in the Big Ten. He had 9 of them. And I mean, they got a transfer corner in Jay Shaw as well, who is also probably going to play a big part of that team defensive scheme in the secondary. So it's really up to Graham Mertz whether or not they get over the hump and do something for real. But I do think that their defense is so good that they will reach that 9 games.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm also going to take the over here on Wisconsin. And I'm going to be riding the fence with a lot of these teams. Like you said earlier, the Big Ten Conference, it was a lot tougher to do this than it was for the SEC for some reason. A lot of these teams just very unsure about, and these win totals really are teeter-tottering on like 1 or 2 games, and I just don't have a strong lean. Wisconsin is no exception. And you're right, everything about the defense last year, they were number 1 in a lot of statistical categories in the country. They were number 3 overall in total efficiency. So the defense was very good. It carried them last year. I mean, Jim Leonard's one of the best defensive coordinators in all of college football, and Wisconsin should be lucky that they still have him. They've been able to retain him. So the defense should still be very good. It should carry this team. Offensively, like you said, Graham Mertz, I mean, he's a redshirt junior now. He really has to figure it out. And if I want to be honest, I can't really bet on that. But if Graham Mertz just shows a little bit of a notch of improvement from last year in his game, I think this Wisconsin team could easily win the Big Ten West division. But if he doesn't, I mean, they're just opening the door for one of these other teams there on the bottom to, or towards the middle, to come up and beat them for the Big Ten West. Like you said, the running backs are very good, two of the best running backs in the country. And then the tight end room should be very good as well. The tight end room is going to be very deep. And that's obviously part of the key ingredient for that Wisconsin formula for the way that they play football. So I'm with you. The non-conference is fairly easy. They got Illinois State at home, Washington State at home, which actually could be a little tricky, but I think that they should probably win that game. I think Washington State is a team with a lot of upside with Cameron Ward at quarterback, but I think that Wisconsin should handle them, especially early in the year. And then New Mexico State. And then the problem with the crossover that I don't really like with their schedule is that they got to go at Ohio State and then at Michigan State in the crossover. So that's definitely going to be tough. I think that with Ohio State games, definitely an L. Michigan State could be. I think Wisconsin might be favored in that one barely, but tread lightly here. But I'm going to go with the over with Wisconsin. And now moving down to Iowa, sitting at 7.5. Iowa.
Tight end
This
you,
one
baby.
was, yeah, Iowa. This one was honestly fairly easy for me. I have a good read on this one, and I'm going to go under. Now, the reason why I'm going with the under here for Iowa is, yes, they won the Big Ten West last year. They went 10-4. They made it to the Big Ten championship game. They had the number 5 most efficient defense in the country. However, they were one of the luckiest teams in college football last year. They were notorious for getting all those turnovers, which just is not a sustainable thing year over year. And they went 4-1 in one possession games. And going further than that, they went 7-1 in games that were decided by 10 points or less. 7-1 in games that were decided by 10 points or less. I just don't see how you can continue that for the next year. So that's why this win total is correctly down at 7.5. I still am going to go under here. And I think the Big Ten West as a whole is going to be a little bit better than last year. I think Iowa's really going to be in for it. I think they could finish as low as 5th in this division. Spencer Petras, he's now a redshirt senior, so it's his 5th year. At this point, I'm done hearing all he might take a leap. He is who he is, and he just hasn't put up that great numbers. Kirk Ferentz's son is the OC, and the offense just hasn't been that great. I don't expect that to improve at all. And then the non-con, they got South Dakota State at home. They got Iowa State at home, which for some reason they always seem to beat Iowa State, even though Iowa State's had better teams than them for a few of the last 5 seasons. And then they got Nevada, so they could potentially be 3-0 after that. And then the crossover, they got Michigan, which isn't really that great of a draw. I think Michigan should beat them. And then they got to go at Ohio State. So the crossover didn't really do them any favors playing the Eastern teams. They got to play Michigan and Ohio State. And I just think Iowa had so many things go right for them last year to get to where they were. I just don't really see that going for them. If anything, I feel like it might flip this year, and I'm going to go under.
You know what, Shoob? I'm absolutely with you in the under. And Iowa, to me, I mean, they are just a carbon copy of Wisconsin, but maybe not as good as Wisconsin defensively. I mean, they are stout on the offensive line year to year. They usually have a very good defense, but they're usually one of those teams that struggles to pass the ball. They're just another version of Wisconsin. They run that kind of pro style offense. They're very inconsistent at the quarterback position. As we mentioned, Spencer Petras is just not the guy. He's going to be their starter, but he has shown time and time again that he struggles. When you look at last year, he had 1,800 passing yards, 10 touchdowns, and 9 picks in a full season. They also lost their 1,000-yard rusher, Tyler Goodson, to the NFL. So that's going to be a big loss for them. Now they have to fill in a whole new void at running back as well. Now, there are some advantages to their offense. Like I kind of hinted earlier, they are tight end in my opinion, when you look at all the people they've put in the NFL here lately, Noah Fant, George Kittle, TJ Hawkinson. And they have another guy who's projected to go in the second or third round, and Sam Laporta. And get this, Sam Laporta had 1/3 of the entire team's passing yards last year. 670 yards, 3 touchdowns. That's 1/3 of Iowa's offensive passing yards last year. So he's pretty influential in that offense. You take him away, and they probably can't get a first down. It's pretty crazy. And then when you look at the defense, they do still have a stout defense, but again, it's the issue of the quarterback. The quarterback is kind of like where you lean here. And then when we are also discussing the other teams that are in this division this year, Nebraska, Minnesota, there's a little bit more talent in this division this year. So having a poor quarterback or having poor quarterback play is definitely going to come back to bite you, especially if you're not forcing those turnovers in those one possession games like you were alluding to earlier, and that they had so much success with last year. Now, let's just look at the defense again here. They have Jack Campbell returning. That's a big return for them. Their star linebacker, who had 140 tackles last year and 2 picks, that is second in the Big Ten. They also have Joe Evans, who's fifth in the Big Ten with sacks last year, with 7 of them coming back. And then a young guy in Lucas Van Ness, who also had 7 sacks as well. And he's a young dude. So all around, they have a lot of returning production on their defense. So their defense is still going to be pretty stout. That's something that Iowa has always been known for. Their offensive line is still going to be pretty stout, despite losing Tyler Linderbaum. But again, like this all comes back. Quarterback, quarterback, quarterback. And this is what we were talking about with Wisconsin. This is why I say that. Like they just mirror each other so well. It's your team success is just so predicated on your quarterback, especially in this conference. But Graham Mertz is the better of those two quarterbacks, so Wisconsin definitely has a higher ceiling. Not only that, but Wisconsin also has a little bit of a better defense as well. But I'm 100% with you on that under, Shoob. 7.5, I think they can get 7. I don't see them getting 8. And, they could be in for a rough year. I mean, potential losses. I mean, Iowa State is probably due to beat them. I know they kind of have their number, but I think Iowa State is due to beat them. They're probably going to lose to Michigan. They're probably going to lose to Ohio State. They're probably going to lose to Wisconsin. And then let's look at Minnesota and Nebraska. They might win one of those two. So it's going to be tough sledding for Iowa moving forward. I 100% agree on the under.
Yeah, their schedule certainly doesn't do them any favors. And again, like when we go through all these team analyses, the schedule at the end of the day, that's arguably going to be the biggest factor that determines which way we go with these over-unders. And I'm with you. When you're comparing Wisconsin and Iowa, let's look at the quarterbacks, Graham Mertz and Spencer Petras. Spencer Petras, I don't really think there's another level to unlock there with him. He is who he is. Graham Mertz, there might still be another level to unlock with him. He's got a little bit more upside. But now moving on to Nebraska, who also similarly to Iowa has a 7.5 win total. Nebraska notoriously last year went 3-9. They were known by many as the greatest 3-9 team of all time. And now their win total has jumped all the way to 7.5. So the sports books certainly haven't looked at last year's record. That doesn't matter to the sports books. Their job is to make money off of you. So what do you got here?
I know you know this stat. What was Nebraska's record in one possession games last year?
It was 0-8.
That's absolutely insane. Especially when we were talking about Iowa's luck being 7-1 in those same circumstances. That's just absolutely insane to me. But Nebraska, speaking of that, I have Nebraska on the over. Believe it or not, Scott Frost, it's time, man. I think it's finally their time to have a very productive season over there in the Big Ten. They have a new transfer quarterback over there in Casey Thompson. I'm actually very excited for them to have Casey Thompson. He's actually no scrub. He showed some promise over at Texas. He had 24 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, 2,100 yards passing. He's also a dual threat guy. Now, they have a solid offensive line, not an elite offensive line, but when you have a dual threat guy like Casey Thompson, he can extend those plays. So really, Nebraska improved at the quarterback position. So, yes, they had a solid runner in Adrian Martinez, but now they have a true bona fide passer as well. They also have a young running back in Ramir Johnson, who is definitely primed to shine now and get a heavier workload. He played a little bit in the latter end of last season and showed some promise. He definitely looks to improve upon his workload, and actually, he's a young guy to definitely watch out for with the Nebraska system. One thing looking at here is Nebraska lost a lot of production in the wide receiver room. They lost Samori Torrey and Austin Allen to the NFL. These are two of their top pass catchers. So now the load looks like it's going to shift over to Omar Manning, who was their third guy in the pecking order last year. Although he did play a little bit, so he at least has some experience. One thing I really wanted to point out about Nebraska is their defense. I think their defense is actually going to be pretty stout. They're going to have a pretty tough run defense. When you look over, they have two really, really stout linebackers, absolute tackle machines, ball magnets. Luke Reimer with 109 tackles, and he's only a sophomore, or he was only a sophomore last year. And then we have Nick Henrik, who had 99 tackles as a freshman last year. These dudes have some linebackers, and they are definitely going to be a formidable force when it comes to playing teams who are run heavy or run reliant, like Wisconsin. So those are going to be good matchups for teams like Nebraska when you have linebackers like this, provided that they can stay healthy. So Nebraska is going to have a very stout run defense. And so for all these reasons, I really like Nebraska on the over.
So this is going to be our first disagreement. I actually am going to have Nebraska under 7.5 wins. Now, again, I don't really have a strong lean here, like I said, for most of these Big Ten teams, but like I did similarly for Auburn as they're under, I'm doing this because of the risk of the head coach being fired, Scott Frost, and the quit factor. And if you look at Nebraska's schedule, I'll get to that in a second here. But one thing that you mentioned was the defense. And the defense, you like the defense a lot. I actually had in my notes here, they only returned 5 starters. So I don't really see this defense being that much better, if at all, than it was last year. It
I
could
like their
potentially be better.
I like their second level guys, the linebackers, and the ability to stop the run. However, the secondary may be questionable, but they're going to be a stout run defense. So when you look at teams like Wisconsin, who maybe struggle to pass the ball a little bit, Iowa, who struggles to pass the ball a little bit, they're going to have good matchups against those teams. So I do think that they'll be able to neck it out against, or at least have a very good chance at beating some of those teams that they really need to get those wins against in order to hit that line. And so that's kind of what I meant when I said that.
Okay, fair point. So the defense will be good or bad based on the matchup. But going further, like you said, Casey Thompson transfers in, Adrian Martinez goes out to Kansas State. And I was looking at Adrian Martinez's numbers last year, and I was surprised to see that, yes, he wasn't the greatest quarterback, but he wasn't that bad. His numbers were still fairly decent in the passing game. They weren't great by any means, but they were still solid. And then he could run the ball as well. And I think that with Casey Thompson, Casey can run a little bit too, but he's not as potent of a dual threat as Adrian Martinez was. So when I'm looking at this transfer situation here, maybe Nebraska fans might disagree with me. If you're a Cornhusker fan, you can let us know in the comments, but I don't really see Casey Thompson being that much of a level above the production that Adrian Martinez was, if you ask me. So that's one of the reasons I have this Nebraska under. Another thing too, actually, that I do like about this Nebraska offense is that Scott Frost went out and hired a new offensive coordinator in Mark Whipple, and Mark Whipple was the offensive coordinator at Pitt and the QB coach for the last 3 seasons at Pitt. And we all know Pitt had a very good offense, especially with Kenny Pickett. That was very good development. So I think that was actually a really good hire. So that could be a good thing for this Nebraska offense that I'm sure will be at least a little bit better than they were last year. I still have questions about the defense, as I mentioned. And again, the schedule, I still think, doesn't really do them many favors, at least in the non-conference. They got Oklahoma at home, which I'm sure they got circled on their calendars. As of right now, I wouldn't predict them to win that game, but we shall see. But I would certainly lean towards that being a loss. The crossover, however, is doable in the East. They don't have to play Ohio State. They get Indiana at home. They go at Rutgers, and they got at Michigan. So you would figure if Nebraska can go 2-1 versus that stretch, that's probably a good thing. But the thing with Nebraska, though, is that if you look at their schedule, if they don't win a bunch of those first 8 games on their schedule, if they only go like 4-4 or maybe even 5-3, I feel like that couldn't be a good sign for Scott Frost, especially if they only win 4 games for that stretch, because you look at the back end of their schedule, their last 4 games, Minnesota, at Michigan, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. That's going to be a tough stretch. And best case scenario, if you're a Nebraska fan, being honest here, I think you'd probably be happy to go 2-2 against that stretch. So again, for all those reasons, especially if Scott Frost is fired towards the end of the season, or if there's a rumors or if it's a foregone conclusion that he will be fired by the latter half of the season, I feel like those are all going to be losses, and that's a huge quit factor for me. So that's why I have the under. But again, not a strong lean there with Nebraska.
You know what's interesting about that OU matchup, Shoob? So I think there is the potential for Nebraska to win that matchup, maybe surprise OU, because OU's under a new regime, new system. They've lost so many players and they brought in so many new players. There's so many people to acclimate into their new system. So it's going to be really interesting to see what Brent Venables does over there. How ready will they be for his first season? How prepared are they going to be for a team like Nebraska, who honestly they may sleep on? A lot of people in those circles don't realize Nebraska went 0-8 in one possession games. They just see the record and think, okay, this is a team we should stomp. But realistically speaking, I do think Nebraska is going to keep this close. If they lose this game, that's fine. But I don't think that they'll lose by more than 2 scores. I think they'll be able to keep it within 10 to 14.
Another thing I wanted to mention before we move on, as we said, Nebraska went 3-9 last year, and they're 0-8 in one possession games.
That's
If you
crazy.
flip their outcome on all 8 of those one possession games, that's an 11-1 team. Can you believe that? If they just had a complete luck reversal of the ball bouncing one way or the other, they could have been an 11-1 team. That is absolutely insane. And there's a reason why this Nebraska team, despite being 3-9, they were still power rated inside the top 25 for most of the season last year. Incredible stuff. I love the quirky outlier stuff like that from year to year. Obviously, Scott Frost doesn't, but we shall see how that goes. It's definitely a big year ahead for the Cornhuskers. Very interesting team to follow. And now moving down here to Minnesota, who also has the same win total. If you're seeing a pattern here of why we're very wishy-washy on these Big Ten teams, it's because 3 teams, if you're looking on YouTube, all have 7.5 as their win total: Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and then Purdue is at 7. So it's a very clumped up Big Ten West here. And Minnesota at 7.5, I have a pretty fair lean here, and I'm going to go over. I like this Minnesota team. They quietly almost backdoored their way into the Big Ten championship game last year. They finished 9-4. And when I say quietly, I mean very quietly. Everyone was focused on Iowa and Wisconsin all year, but Minnesota almost got their way in. If Iowa hadn't won the last game of the season, they would have got into the Big Ten championship game. And nobody talked about Minnesota last year. They were competitive in every game. The Gophers lost by no more than 14 points in any of their games. So they were competitive in every single game they played. They gave Ohio State a very solid game at the beginning of last year, if you guys recall. And QB Tanner Morgan comes back. He is, I believe, a 6th-year senior. It feels like Tanner Morgan's been in Minnesota forever. So he's definitely using that COVID eligibility. And he had poor numbers last year. And it really doesn't make sense to me because the last 2 seasons, his numbers were rather poor, but he lit it up in that 2019 season, if you guys recall, as a
Rashad
sophomore.
Bateman and Tyler Johnson, man.
He did have good receivers, but he lit it up last year, or in that season in 2019. They do return running back Mohamed Ibrahim from injury. He was injured for basically all of last season, so getting him back at running back will definitely be a boost. And all of their top receivers return from last year as well. So that's very good offensively. And also, this is the biggest nugget here. Their new co-offensive coordinator is Kirk Soraka, and he returns after being the offensive coordinator and QB coach when he was there in 2019. So Kirk Soraka was the OC when Minnesota had that really good 2019 season, and Tanner Morgan was very comfortable and looked really good in Soraka's system. So I feel like Soraka returning back to Minnesota with Tanner Morgan, I think there's going to be that comfortability, that familiarity there. I think Tanner Morgan can have a really good season, especially with all the pass catchers returning. And as far as the defense, it was actually number 19 last year in efficiency. It was surprisingly pretty good, but they do lose a lot, especially on the D line, which is a big red flag. Obviously, they lose 2 defensive linemen to the draft. And then their non-conference is pretty winnable. They got New Mexico State at home, Western Illinois, and then Colorado. I think Colorado is going to be pretty bad this year. So they should honestly really be 3-0 with those non-conference games. And then the cross-divisional playing over in the East really isn't that tough. They got to go at Michigan State, which could be a 50-50 game. They go at Penn State, which will be tough, obviously, but they got Rutgers at home, so they don't have to play Michigan or Ohio State. So you definitely can't tell me that none of those games I just mentioned aren't winnable. I think this Minnesota team, outside of the defensive line and the trenches, which are big question marks, you can't deny they got really good skill position players. And I think Kirk Soraka could be a huge difference maker for this team. I'm going over 7.5. And I think this team is capable of winning the Big Ten West.
I'm 100% with you, Shoob. I have the over for Minnesota. I mean, when you look at the stats, they had the number two ranked defense in the Big Ten last year, which is absolutely fantastic considering it is a defensive conference. And like you said, they did that very quietly. They did a lot of things very quietly last year, especially after losing Mohamed Ibrahim. I think a lot of people wrote them off, considering how just dynamic he was. I mean, he had 2,000-yard seasons, one as a freshman, a true freshman. So people thought he was going to be the X factor for them, and losing him was a big deal. He tore his Achilles, but it looks like he may return next season. He's on track to return. You know what's interesting is that they replaced him with a three-headed monster between Kai Thomas, who averaged 7.3 yards per carry, Marquise Irving, and Trey Potts. Three-headed monster of all these guys are young guys in their system, and all of them had 500 to 700 yards rushing and pretty good yards per carry average. It was all 7, 5, and whatnot. So they actually have some options there if Mo Ibrahim needs to take a little bit of a back burner on his workload to maybe ease back in from injury or whatever the case may be, because we all know that an Achilles is a crazy injury. It's probably one of the worst injuries that you can have in all of sports, except for maybe dislocating your spine or something. So um, I hope Mohamed Ibrahim gets better because he was showing a lot of dynamic playmaking ability and he was looking like an NFL guy. So hopefully this doesn't impair his career in the future. Another thing I really want to mention about Minnesota that I really like about them is they have such an experienced offensive line. When you look at their depth chart, they have 7 seniors in their two deep. 7 seniors in their two deep. They have so much. And then when you look at what they lost, I mean, they lost Boy Mafi to the NFL. But they also brought in a key transfer defensive back in Beanie Bishop. And I mean, there's a lot of Western Kentucky guys who are flying under the radar who transferred to other teams, especially here in the Big Ten. And this is no exception. This is one of those guys. He was their best defensive back. He had 3 interceptions, a lot of pass deflections, and he's going to play a vital role in that Minnesota secondary. So they do have a very solid defense. And I do think, if anything, I think that they'll at least reach the status quo from last season. I think that they are definitely a team that I would like for 8 to 9 wins for sure.
Absolutely. So we're in agreement on Minnesota, definitely a sleeper team in the Big Ten West. Now moving down to Purdue. Purdue is at an even or a whole number at 7 games. What do you got for the Boilermakers?
So for the Boilermakers, this is tough, but I am going with the under for the Boilermakers. Yes, they do have a very good quarterback with Aiden O'Connell, who had 3,700 yards last season, 28 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. But let's just think about this. They lost David Bell to the NFL draft, who was 1/3 of their passing production. Then here recently, they lost Milton Wright, who had 700 yards receiving. And he's academically ineligible and he's no longer with the team. So that is 2,000 yards of lost production that they for their passing game. So Aiden O'Connell is now going to have to turn to guys like Jackson Anthrop, who was the next guy up. I think he had 600 yards. So he's no scrub. He gets a little bit of playing time. But when you lose your top 2 options like that, it is really hard to have the same year that you had the year prior. So that's definitely going to be a hoop that Aiden O'Connell is going to have to jump through. And it's going to be interesting to see how he responds to that. It's really going to show his mettle. He's going to be tested. And when you look at it, that's 54% of their production loss just between those 2 players. They have running back in King Doru, who had around 500 yards last season. He was their lead rusher. They're not really an elite rushing team by any means, but they can sling it. But if losing these 2 receivers impairs their ability to sling the ball and they don't have an effective rushing attack, then it may spell a lot of bad things for Purdue, especially offensively. When you look over defensively, though, they have 10 of the 11 of their projected starters on defense are seniors, and their 2 deep is also loaded with seniors as well. So they definitely have a lot of experience returning. They do lose some big guys like George Karlaftis to the NFL and Jalen Alexander, who had 114 tackles. I mean, they are losing some pretty big pieces to that defense, but they also still have a lot of experience. So it'll be interesting to see. This is why they're such a big toss up for me. It's really hard to gauge where Purdue's going to be because I don't know how Aiden O'Connell's going to respond offensively to the loss of 54% of his offensive, weapons as far as in terms of yardage. I don't know how Purdue's going to respond to losing George Karlaftis and Jalen Alexander, two of their best defenders, especially when they have a deep group of defenders who are still there and experienced, even though they lost some of their best guys. So Purdue is one of those interesting teams, but just given their schedule and given some of the teams in this division, I like them for the under. I think, if anything, the reason I chose them for the under is I think 7 wins is about where I peg them. And if you were going to pick this team for 7 wins, that's not hitting the over. That's just getting your money back. So basically, if you're going to bet on this, you're either betting to push or to lose. And that's why I took the under on this, Shoob.
So we disagree once again. I actually have the over here. And of course, losing their top receivers certainly hurts. And there are some red flags for this team, but I'm actually fairly high on this team. And I think this Purdue team has some upside. If you look at the numbers last year, they went 9-4. They had a pretty solid season and they were pretty balanced on both sides of the ball. They had the number 31 most efficient offense and the number 26 most efficient defense. That's pretty balanced. And there's not a lot of teams that were top inside the top 31 and had that balance on both sides of the ball in the Power Five. Aiden O'Connell, like you mentioned, he was very good last year, one of the most underrated players in all of college football. The thing that really struck me, though, about Aiden O'Connell is that he put up those numbers last year with one of the worst offensive lines in FBS. I was kind of surprised to see this. Purdue was bottom 5 in FBS and line yards for the O-line. So it was pretty impressive to see that Aiden O'Connell was doing that. Of course, a lot of that, I'm sure, was a lot of quick hitters to David Bell, who he's going to lose. So I think having speedy receivers that he can hit quickly are certainly going to be a big factor for the way this offense can move. But I do still like what Purdue's got. Of course, losing your top receiver and David Bell and your top defender and George Karlaftis to the NFL, that's going to hurt. But they still do return a lot of starters, especially on the defense. I think the defense can still has a chance to be a little bit better than they were last year, even with losing Karlaftis. And the thing is, it's the schedule, man. The schedule actually, if you look at it, is pretty favorable. Okay, so they got their non-conference. They got Indiana State at home, which should be a win. They go at Syracuse, which might be a little bit tricky, but I think they should be favored in that game. And then they got Florida Atlantic at home. And then you look at their crossover. Once again, they avoid Ohio State and Michigan. So many of these Big Ten West win totals are just looking over, do they avoid Michigan and Ohio State? That's pretty much what it comes down to for a lot of these. And that's the case with Purdue. They got Penn State at home, which I think that game is to open the year as well. And I think that's Penn State's on upset alert. They're going to be on the road at Purdue to open the year. Purdue can certainly beat the Nittany Lions. And they go at Maryland, which is a winnable game. And then they go at Indiana, which is definitely a winnable game. I think this Purdue team, despite all those lost production at receiver, I still think Aiden O'Connell can carry this team. Of course, if O'Connell were to get hurt, Purdue doesn't necessarily have the depth at QB like they used to in recent years. But I'm going to roll the dice and say that the Boilermakers go over here, though I'm not super confident about it. And now moving down here, these are teams that are very likely to not win the Big Ten West. And this is a team that, for those of you who watch this channel, I'm sure that if you follow the Illinois dynasty, there's probably a lot of you Illini fans that have been watching. So for those of you that have followed this channel, for those of you who have found this channel because of the Illinois dynasty, this one you might be paying a little bit close attention to, and this one's very important to me. So I'll make sure to give you a good analysis for you guys on this Illini squad. The over-under here is pegged at 4.5, which is pretty low. It's Brett Bielema's second season at Illinois and Champaign. Illinois actually had a very solid defense last year. However, the biggest problem with this Illini squad is that they're number 115 in returning production. They lose a lot of guys from last year's team. They were relatively competitive last year, even though they didn't make a bowl game. They'd lost 5 games by 10 points or less. So again, they were pretty competitive even in those losses. They do have a new offensive coordinator, Barry Loomy from UTSA, which I think was a very good hire because UTSA had one of the best offenses in all of G5 last year. So I think that was a very good hire for Brett Bielema, but it will be his first year at OC. The problem, though, is the quarterback play last year for the Illini was not that good, and I don't really see it getting that much better, to be frank. They do bring in transfer Tommy DeVito from Syracuse, who has put up rather mediocre numbers in his career there. And then he's going to be in a QB battle with Artur Sitkowski, who also put up rather mediocre numbers. But we'll see if the new offensive coordinator can maybe elevate those guys a little bit. They did lose a few key players on defense, but they do return linebacker Calvin Hart from injury. And of course, they got Keith Randolph, the defensive end, who is an absolute stud. He's an absolute stud in our dynasty. He led the NCAA in sacks for the 2022 season in our dynasty. Love that guy. I don't know if he can quite do this in real life, but in our dynasty, he did very well. And they're non-conference. They got Wyoming at home, Virginia, and then Chattanooga, and then their cross-divisional games. They got Michigan State at home. Then they got to go at Michigan and at Indiana. So to be truthful, my initial lean was to take the under here because of all the lost production, but I'm still very 50-50, like for most of these teams on this win total here at 4.5 for the Illini. So if it's coming down to a coin flip, I'll do this for the brand, for the channel, for you guys, for you Illini fans watching. I'm going to give the Illini an over, even though I am truthfully not very confident about it.
Fair enough, Shoob. I think the biggest reason for me, I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to take the under here for the Illini.
How dare you?
Oh, Epstein. But anyway, so basically, when you look at the quarterback situation here, that's the biggest thing to me right here. The quarterback play in a conference where the defense is so stout, it's going to be really tough. Now, one thing, Artur Sitkowski was actually having a pretty good year last year before injury. He had 6 touchdowns and 2 interceptions at 700 yards. He was actually doing pretty decent before he got hurt. But you have him in a QB battle with Tommy DeVito, and traditionally speaking, before that, neither one has been very productive or effective in their careers. On defense, they lost their top safety, Kirby Joseph, to the NFL. That's a big loss too. He was one of their leaders in many defensive statistical categories. Good news is Isaiah Williams returns. If you watch the Dynasty, Isaiah Williams is also a part of the Dynasty.
He's my quarterback, or he was our quarterback, which I don't want to get into that. I don't want to waste too much time here, but very funny how in real life, how different his career is turning out than in my Dynasty.
Yeah. But, the one thing that really worries me about Illinois is they only averaged 20 points per game last year. It's one of the worst in the entire conference, and they're not really getting any better offensively after losing their 1,000-yard rusher. And with the quarterback situation being a little shaky, they also don't have one of the best offensive lines out there. And then in addition to that, they also play Virginia and Wyoming, and they're out of conference. I can see them going 1-1, possibly even 0-2 in that, because Wyoming is one of those teams that often gets overlooked, but they know how to ball out west. They can play a little bit. But UVA, I think, is definitely going to probably beat them, and then I think Wyoming could upset them as well. So I really like the under. I don't think they're going to win a lot of Big Ten games either, so I'm sticking with the under for Illinois, Shoob.
The Illini actually have a pretty good running back room with Chase Brown and Josh McCray. Josh McCray is an absolute animal. That guy's massive. But I just wanted to let you guys know that, but not that it's going to make a massive difference here for that win total. It probably won't at all. But so how about Northwestern here, the final team here in the Big Ten West? They are sitting at 3.5 as their win total. They are projected to finish last in the Big Ten West. And this Northwestern squad, they had a very bad year last year. They went 3-9. Pat Fitzgerald, known as one of the better coaches in all of college football, known for doing a lot more with less. It was a rough season for him last year. What do you got with Northwestern?
3.5 games. Under. Well, Northwestern, they're such a weird team, Shoob. Aren't they a weird team? And weren't they in the Big Ten championship a few years ago? I mean, my goodness. So when you look at Northwestern, let's just look at their team last year. Last year, they had the worst offense in the Big Ten and one of the absolute worst defenses in the Big Ten as well. Combine bad offense, bad defense, it is a recipe for disaster. In addition to that, they lost Brandon Joseph, arguably their best defender. So that's going to make it very tough on them. When you evaluate how poor their offense is, they're non-con, they're playing Duke, Southern Illinois, Miami, Ohio, Um, they might not even win all those games, which I mean, when you come to the Big Ten and it's a defensive conference and you already struggle to score the ball, it's going to be so tough for them. Um, in not in hindsight, in let's just say the advantages for Northwestern, they have their all-purpose running back Evan Hull, um, who rushed for 1,000 yards last season and 9 touchdowns. Actually, I may have to double check this. I think they're actually losing him, so that's a lot of production lost right there. They have transfer Ryan Helinski, who is probably going to start at quarterback, but it's still up for toss-ups, and he hasn't even been the most stout in his career as well. And then you have wide receiver Malik Washington, who is actually returning, and he's 17th in receiving yards in the Big Ten. Although I think he had 600, 700 yards, nothing too crazy. One person that I really want to highlight for that Northwestern defense, Chris Bergen, who's number 3 in tackles and number 1 in solo tackles in the entire NCAA. I mean, that dude's an absolute beast. But, Northwestern is known for having these defensive studs. The problem is their offense, Shoob. I really just do not trust their offense in any way, shape, or form to score in the Big Ten. And I think they may even lose some of these non-con games that they should win as well.
I am in agreement with you. I'm going to go with the under at 3.5 here for Northwestern. And I don't know why, but I just feel like this is going to come back to bite us because, like you were saying, Northwestern is such an odd team to figure out year in and year out. And this just seems like one of those years where Northwestern surprises us somehow and makes a bowl game. It's just Pat Fitzgerald just has a knack for doing that. So now that we both have the under, it's like, okay, now I feel like Northwestern's going to make a bowl game now. But
You're welcome, Northwestern fans.
yeah, exactly. But they were pretty evenly bad on both sides of the ball last year, number 102 and 103 in offense and defensive efficiency, respectively, last year. QB play, as you highlighted, was very poor, and Helinski returns. The D line was one of the worst in all of FBS last year. And also, they lost their best player, defensive back Brandon Joseph. He transferred to Notre Dame. So that certainly doesn't help at all for Northwestern. And the thing is, there is a path to this over for sure, but this is what Northwestern's going to have to do. They have to sweep that non-conference schedule. And I actually think they can sweep it fairly reasonably because they got Duke, Southern Illinois, Miami of Ohio, but this Duke team, I think, is going to be pretty awful, actually. So I think they actually kind of got a good draw catching Duke at home this year, but that's still only 3 wins. They do get Illinois at home at the final season of the year. So they'd have to beat the Illini. They have to win a Big Ten conference game. I mean, that goes without saying. Maybe they upset one of these other teams here. Maybe they catch them sleeping. But of course, that non-conference, if they only go 2-1 in that non-con, I don't think this over is going to hit. So I think it's fairly safe to lean towards the under here, but not very strong with Northwestern. So once again, thank you guys for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, this is going to conclude our video. We're going to have another video as we move over to the Big Ten East.